The Greatest Train Robbery, 1963, in United Kingdom, the night of August 8, 1963, began like any other for the Royal Mail train, leaving Glasgow and heading to London. Inside its carriages were not only letters and parcels, but also an extraordinary load of cash being transported from banks in Scotland to the Bank of England. More than 120 bags filled with money, equal to millions in today's value, sat locked in the high-security mail coaches. It was supposed to be just another routine journey. But that night, a group of men with nerves of steel, armed not only with tools, but also with a plan, crafted over months, would stop this train in its tracks and commit one of the most famous robberies in history. The plan was the brainchild of Bruce Reynolds, a charismatic Londoner with a taste for the high life. He was no ordinary petty thief. Reynolds wanted a job that would make history. He brought together a gang of over 15 men, each carefully chosen for their skills. There was Gordon Goody, Reynolds' trusted right-hand man. There was Biggs, Ronnie Biggs, who would later become one of the most famous names linked to the crime. There were strongmen, drivers, and specialists who knew how to deal with trains and signals. This wasn't just a group of criminals. This was a team assembled like soldiers preparing for a mission. Their target was train number 1, M44, famously known as the Up Special. Traveling from Glasgow to London carrying mail and money, on that night, it carried an unusually high amount of cash due to a holiday. The gang had inside information that the train would be loaded with more than £2.5 million, today worth over $60 million US. This wasn't a chance robbery. Every move was calculated, every role assigned. The gang even studied the railway system to learn how to stop the train without raising suspicion. Just after 3 a.m., near a remote section of track at Ledburn in Buckinghamshire, the gang put their plan into action. They tampered with the railway signals, turning the green light to red. The driver, David Whitby, saw the red light and brought the train to a halt, as he was trained to do. What he didn't know was that a gang of masked men was waiting in the darkness. Within moments, the robbers swarmed the locomotive. The driver was overpowered, though not without a struggle. The men had expected to move the engine themselves, but realized they couldn't operate it. That's where Ronnie Biggs' connection came in. A retired train driver named Stan Agate, who had been recruited specifically to drive the train after it was stopped. With the guards subdued and the engine under their control, the gang uncoupled the first 2 cars, the engine and the high-value mail carriage. They drove them about half a mile down the track to a pre-planned spot near a bridge where a waiting truck stood ready. Then came the moment that would make history. Over 120 sacks of banknotes, some still bundled, were unloaded by hand and carried to the waiting vehicle. It took nearly half an hour of hard labor, but by the end, the robbers had loaded more than £2.5 million into their truck. For a crime in 1963, this was an unimaginable fortune. The gang drove the loot to a hideout they had prepared in advance, Leatherslade Farm, a rural property rented under a false name. There, they celebrated their success. Newspapers later reported that the men played Monopoly using real money stolen from the train, a detail that only fueled public fascination with the case. The plan had worked perfectly. No one had been killed, the police were nowhere in sight, and the gang had escaped with the biggest robbery Britain had ever seen. But their success didn't last long. The one weakness of their plan was time. They had expected to leave the farm within a day or two, but as police activity grew, they stayed longer than they should have. Fingerprints were left behind on cups, dishes, and even on the Monopoly board. The farm, which was supposed to be a safe house, became the very place that betrayed them. When police eventually discovered it, they collected enough evidence to begin tracking down the men. Over the next months, one by one, the robbers were arrested. The public was glued to the newspapers as details of the crime unfolded. The idea that a group of ordinary men had pulled off such a daring feat fascinated the country. When the trial began in 1964, it was described as the trial of the century. 13 of the robbers received sentences of up to 30 years in prison, among the harshest ever handed down in Britain for robbery. But the story didn't end there. Several of the gang made daring escapes from prison, keeping the legend alive. Ronnie Biggs became the most famous when he escaped Wandsworth Prison in 1965 by climbing over the wall with a rope ladder. He fled to Paris, then to Australia, and eventually settled in Brazil. For decades, he lived as a fugitive, taunting the British authorities who were unable to extradite him due to Brazil's laws at the time. He became a symbol of rebellion, appearing in newspapers and even songs, living a life of infamy rather than obscurity. The Great Train Robbery became more than just a crime. It became a story deeply embedded in British culture. To some, the robbers were villains who had committed a serious crime, traumatized railway workers, and stolen money that never truly belonged to them. To others, they were folk heroes, men who outsmarted the system, pulled off the impossible, and lived like outlaws in an age where such stories belonged in movies rather than reality. Decades later, questions still remain. Who gave the gang the inside information about the money on the train? Is there ever a missing mastermind who was never caught? And what happened to much of the stolen money which was never recovered? The mystery continues to fuel books, documentaries, and films, keeping the story alive for new generations. In the end, the Great Train Robbery of 1963 was more than just about money. It was about daring, planning, and the human desire to attempt the impossible. It showed how ambition and greed can drive men to risk everything, and how even the most perfect plan can fall apart with the smallest mistake. More than 60 years later, it still remains one of the most famous robberies in history, a crime that turned ordinary men into legends, and a story that refuses to be forgotten.